Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Mattis. I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Association of Episcopal Schools. And I'm joined today by Mary Catherine Duffy. Mary Catherine, good afternoon.
Hello.
Mary Catherine is the head of school at St. Albans Episcopal School in Harlingen. Will be working with us today on our webinar that is entitled Difficult Conversations, 8 Strategies That Actually Work. So thank you so much for joining us today. One really quick housekeeping item. If you will look for a box that says Q&A, it probably is at the bottom of your screen. We're going to use that Q&A box to interact today. So if you would just click on that Q&A box and let's give it a test drive and send as a question the city that you are currently located in, and that will show us that the Q&A box is working. So if you'll just type in the city that you are joining us from. And perfect, things are coming in. Great. So Odessa's with us, Richmond's with us, fantastic, Edinburgh, welcome, Baton Rouge. Okay, that's working. So please, as the conversation unfolds today, make sure to use that Q&A box. And as soon as questions pop up, enter those in the Q&A box. I don't want you to lose a good question just because we're not at a stopping point. So as soon as you enter that into the Q&A box, we'll get that question and make sure that we get to it before we wrap up today. So thank you so much for that, and do not be afraid to enter a question. Looking forward to visiting with you today. So difficult conversations, of course, part of the work that we do in school leadership. There's lots of different types of difficult conversations that present themselves. And so the first thing I would like to do is ask a question. Of all of the possible difficult conversations that are out there, just give us an idea of which type of conversation is causing the most anxiety. So for example, conversations with parents, conversations with faculty members, conversation with board members, maybe the conversation with the rector, maybe there's a conversation we haven't even identified yet. So let's go ahead and take a moment. If everyone will complete that survey, go ahead and just tell us from your perspective, which conversation do you think is causing the most anxiety? We'll give you a few seconds to work on that. Leave it open for about another 5 seconds or so. Okay, last call. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so pretty much an even split between conversation with parents and conversation with faculty members. Everyone seems to be pretty comfortable visiting with their board members, so that's good. And then a few have noted that sometimes conversations with the rector have been anxiety provoking. So that's good to know. That gives us a little perspective of some of the questions that may pop up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Catherine Duffy. And one of the first things we're going to look at is all the different possible areas for difficult conversations. Mary Catherine.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, that's right. So I've been at my school for 17 years. And so out of those years of experience is the fruit you are seeing on the screen, the fruit of having to have difficult relationships sometimes and conversations with people. And it's funny because, yeah, I'm sure we could come up with even, there's 7 of them on here, and I'm sure we could come up with another one. So, you know, some of the relationships in our schools, as you know, are definitely rich soil for difficulty. You have all kinds of, some of the things that I have found in my experience have been, you know, parent-teacher conferences, where the parent doesn't necessarily want to hear what the teacher has to say. So if you're a teacher out there, that's tough. Student teachers, when a teacher has to talk to a student about something they're not comfortable, you know, they're not doing well academically, they're not doing well behaviorally, that's hard. If you're an administrator, one of the hardest things, that, at least for me, is just, you know, feeling like I have to defend my school, defend my teachers. That can always be a difficult conversation. Teachers and administrators, you guys talked about that. Teachers and administrators having to have conversations about professionalism or teaching. A head of school and a board member, if there are any board members out there, one of the things that can be hard is when a board member if the board chair has to have a difficult conversation with the head of school, that's an evaluation can be difficult. There can be difficulty in that. We talked a little bit about the head of school and the rector. That can be difficult if it's not a good relationship. One of the things back to the parents and the relationships with parents, whether it's a parent teacher or an administrator parent, I don't know about everybody else, but I find that everyone is on a low simmer these days. Everyone's on a low simmer. Our society is on a low simmer where you're about to boil over at any moment, and you never know when it's going to happen. Years ago, Connie Wooten came to my board and talked with the board and with the faculty about parents. And this was years ago, and it's even gotten worse. She really predicted this, where parents are on they're just waiting to attack for some reason. And we're seeing that, again, culturally, societally, and we're seeing it definitely in our schools. So these are all relationships that make conversations difficult. So let's talk about some of the strategies that we commonly use to deal with difficult situations. So avoid, accommodate, attacks. So these are the things that I thought about when kind of making this slide about what are the things that we want to do that are easier than kind of just being direct. Of course, the first one is denial. That's easy. That's just easy just to pretend it doesn't exist. Sarcasm, kind of being snide, making a little comment about something here or there, but never really directly having that conversation. Shaming, that's an easy one to do. That's an easy one, especially with, I think, with students, teachers and students. I think it's an easy one as an administrator and a teacher. I think unfortunately, that's a common way to deal with that. Bribery, subtle hints, that's my favorite. Subtle hints are kind of say it to a bunch of, kind of say it kind of on the sideways without really being direct. And then one of the big ones that I ran into in the very beginning that was really something that I didn't do well, and that was the idea of group rules or discussion. So my example for that is I had a teacher who was continually late, perpetually late. And rather than deal with her one-on-one, I would send out blanket emails about being on time. Well, let me tell you what that does. The people who are rule followers, they feel like you're talking to them. And the people who are not rule followers, typically the people who are late, they don't know who you're talking about. And so I did it not only as an email, but I did it, and we're going to talk about that later, but I also did it in the faculty meetings. Rather than just say, hey, so-and-so, I need you to be on time, I would just go into like a discussion with the whole group. And that always backfires. So these strategies that we use to deal with difficult situations, avoiding, accommodating, even attacking, those are all bad strategies when it comes to trying to have fruitful conversation. So I love this. All confrontation is a search for the truth. So my friend Amy Harrington, who's our business manager, in the beginning of my years here, she was just my rock and still is. But she said to me one time, she said, I know that parents oftentimes wear you out, but I think if you remember that everyone is doing the best they can, and everyone is trying to do what they think is right for their kid. I loved that, because that's similar to what this means. We're all trying to search for the truth. And so whenever you're confronting something, whenever there's a difficult conversation, we're really trying to get to the same place. Sometimes we bring baggage with it. And so if you can remember, number one, that we're all searching for the truth. And I think number two, Brene Brown said this. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Brene Brown. She's one of my favorites. And she recently did a video about when you are dealing with somebody that's difficult, or you're having a hard conversation, if you can believe that we're all doing the very best we can, it makes it easier to have that conversation. So I like that.
That's a really good piece of advice. I like the idea of trying to not project bad motives on the person just because it's a high anxiety situation.
Right.
And that's
Right.
I think we sometimes fall into that trap of getting defensive. And I like how she reframes that, because it puts a more, more neutral, if not directly a positive approach to the interaction right before you have the conversation.
Right. And I think also with regard to that, I think, again, back to acknowledging that as a society and as a culture and as a school, we're dealing with parents who are anxiety ridden, and everybody's, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but everybody is just on a low simmer, ready to, and it doesn't take much to boil over. And so if you can, I remember one time we had a kid who came to school and he wasn't behaving. He was losing it. And it was 8 o'clock in the morning. And, the teacher got really frustrated very easily. Well, it turned out that kid had witnessed a really, really bad fight between his parents. And he came to school like 30 minutes after that happened. And of course that was how it manifested. And so I think if we can find ways to, whether it's the child or the parent or the administrator or whatever, if we can find ways to see that maybe they're really doing the very best they can right now, and offer grace, that's helpful. Okay, so what are some strategies? And you guys know that if you have a question, you feel free to ask it, and David will kind of share it with us. But what are some strategies that actually work? So we know the things that don't work: shaming, being snide, giving group emails, group directives. Those are not working. But here are the 8 strategies that I feel like actually really do help you have more success in difficult conversations. So the first one is to be prepared. Second one, listen, listen, listen. Third is to show empathy and compassion. Fourth is to be authentic. Fifth is to build relationships. 6, have conversations with your mouth. I love that one. We're going to talk more about that one. Don't climb the ladder of inference, and stay healthy. So let's talk about each one of these individually. Strategy number 1, be prepared. So I'm a cook. I love to cook. You don't start cooking without prep work, and you don't start having conversations without thinking through what you're going to do. Again, this whole slide deck is just a slide deck of all the mistakes that I made. So all of the things that I did wrong is what you're seeing. The first one, I did this regularly, and it wasn't intentional really, but I oftentimes would just kind of, I'm not saying fly off the handle. I didn't do that. I don't have a bad temper, but I definitely felt free to say whatever I thought at whatever time I thought, because I thought everybody was like that. And I learned my lesson really the hard way over and over again in the first couple of years. And then I started to go, wait, maybe if I think before I speak, and this will go better. And so one of the things that I start with is I get as much information as I can before I have a conversation. If a parent comes to me and says, so-and-so screamed at my kid for 30 minutes and blah, blah, blah. Okay, let me find out more information about the situation. I will call you in less than 24 hours, and I'll give you information on what I know. And then I go find out what happened. And I also, when I get the details of what happened, kind of what's the non-emotional details, the next thing is to say, what am I feeling about the situation? Am I frustrated? Am I upset? Am I nervous? What am I feeling? I think that's really critical to be able to identify what emotions you're feeling so that you can manage them when you're about to have the conversation. Where do I fit into the situation? Did I create part of the problem? Was I part of the problem? This is true a lot of times between an administrator and a teacher. Maybe I didn't communicate properly what I was looking for. Maybe I didn't give enough instruction. Maybe I have given kind of, blanket emails and you're not hearing me. So I haven't been direct enough. So being prepared and really thinking through what you want to say before you say it is absolutely critical. Okay, so strategy number 2 is listening. And I'm going to be honest with you, listening is much harder for me to do than talking. I am a talker. I got talks too much in second grade because I like to talk. And so when I came into this job, I found it really hard to listen. And I thought I was listening. I did. I'm like, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I wasn't really listening. I wasn't listening in the way that people felt heard. And part of the challenge of that is that sometimes you listen to somebody's, like a parent. This has happened to me several times. I'm sure it's not ever happened to anybody else, but where I listened and we disagreed, and then the parent goes out and tells everyone that I don't listen. Well, I did listen. I just didn't agree, and that's a challenge too, because you got to at least make people feel heard. So one of the things I do is I take notes. I find that being defensive comes easy, but listening really requires just literally listening without deciding. And one of the ways that makes it easier for me is that I take notes and I ask questions. So when somebody's complaining to me, I will say, now tell me more about that. Well, then what happened? And I'm writing it down. And so when you are writing down the things that people are saying, number one, it makes them feel better because they know you're actually listening, so you can write it down. But number two, sometimes they're less likely to say something that maybe they would say. So I had a conversation with a parent who was complaining to me that everyone in the 7th grade that left St. Albans last year, every single one of those 7th graders were failing math. And I said, oh, okay. Well, tell me more about that. Well, I said, can you give me names? Well, as soon as I said that, she was like, and she saw me writing, she didn't like that. Well, it turns out I got a couple of kids that were struggling, and guess what? They struggled at St. Albans. Not that we didn't need to listen to some of the things about math, but listening and writing it down is helpful. Listening without deciding, that was hard for me in the beginning. I want to defend. This is my school. I love this school. But listening without deciding is really critical. And that's that judgment piece, that listening without being judgmental. Avoid autobiographical listening. I was the worst at this. I would hear somebody say something and automatically think of a story that I could agree with, right? So, oh, well, yeah, I understand that. Let me tell you about the time. Autobiographical listening is not a good way to resolve conflict because they don't feel heard. So not talking about yourself is great. Giving undivided attention. Obviously, I turn off the music. I put up my phone. I don't have any kind of distraction when I'm listening. Using a neutral tone of voice. Y'all, this is hard when you've got a mad person across the table. It's hard. It's hard for me. I'm not a neutral person. I'm pretty, I'm emotional and I'm ramped up most of the time. And so having a calm demeanor is really, it's important, and it's something I've really worked at. I wasn't like that in the beginning.
What strategies or what specific things have you done that had helped with that?
Breathing. I do a lot of breathing exercises. If I'm sitting at a table, I'm pointing over to my table. If I'm sitting at the table and somebody's getting all messed up across the table from me, I'm going to start breathing pretty heavy. And it just calmly, and I'll listen. Obviously, I don't let you attack me or a teacher. If that's happening, I'm going to stand up and say, you know what? Time out. This meeting's over until we can be reasonable and we can be adults. And so
that's a really important tip also. And I remember coaching heads on that and also faculty members on that. It is important, I think, to recognize when a constructive conversation is possible and when it's not.
Right. I agree.
And if the emotions are such that a constructive conversation probably isn't possible, I think that's a good strategy, is to just do what you did, which is, you know what, I understand you're upset, but I think we need to reconvene at a time where we can have a little more constructive conversation.
Exactly. I think that's excellent. The last one is physically engaging with the speaker. And that's just, for me, obviously that's not a situation maybe in an anger situation, but I tend to, I have probably laid off or fired over the years 15 or 20 people. And that's never easy, and that's a difficult conversation, but I've tried to do it in a way that's helpful and kind. And if I have to physically engage with my teacher, give them a hug or whatever, I'm happy to do that. They just want to be cared for and felt like they're loved.
And that can be tricky too.
Yeah,
I mean, that can be particularly, that's not a strategy to use when emotions are high, for example.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So show empathy and compassion. What is the unspoken message by your words? I encourage you, if you have not read Daring Greatly, to read it. If you have not read any of Brene Brown's stuff, she is phenomenal. And she is truthfully, she is teaching empathy and compassion like no one else. And we're trying to teach that truthfully in our school. It's a big deal right now. We've been doing a lot of conversation around empathy and compassion the last couple of months. And just the way you kind of show up for people. And so when you have a hard conversation, one way to have a hard conversation is to understand. I mean, I laid off about 4 teachers about 4 years ago in the summer. I laid them off in the summer, and it was hard. And I did not try to do anything but seek to understand where they were coming from, to validate. When somebody's frustrated about something, avoiding being defensive is maybe the best thing you can do. When somebody comes in and says, I had a parent yesterday who was frustrated by the lunch deal, and we have an outsource on our lunch program. We outsource it, and we've had some issues. And I'm not going to be defensive about that. I'm going to look at them and say, tell me more about that. One way we do that, we show empathy and compassion, is we say, tell me more. Help me understand your perspective. Instead of offering up our perspective, well, this is why I did what I did. To say, tell me more about why you feel that way, how you see things. I love that language, because that language is validating. We may not agree. At the end of the meeting, we may not agree. You may think that you should have gotten a higher, a better evaluation, and I may have thought it was fine. But at least I'm listening to your perspective, and I'm validating kind of how you feel, whether we agree or not. So empathy and compassion. And I think one more thing on this slide. I think when we get 50,000 feet up, let's not talk about just one conversation, but as a general rule, if you spend your time on a daily basis showing empathy and compassion to everyone, then it's easier to have those conversations when you have to have them. So if people know that you are a compassionate person in general, that's going to make it easier. I say be authentic. This is a big deal for me, obviously, which sometimes got me into some trouble. But, authentic leadership emphasizes honest relationships, values the input of others. It's really important to be authentic. And the first way for me to be authentic is I don't pretend that I know. I don't feel it necessary, even in the beginning. Again, that got me in trouble in the beginning. But I don't pretend I know the answer. And if I don't know the answer, I'm just simply going to say, I don't know the answer. And let me find out the answer. If you don't know it, say so. Admit what you don't know and get the answer. Engage sincerely and be willing to be honest. If we have messed something up at the school, I try very hard to say, you know what? That's us. We did that. That's on us, and let us fix that. Rather than try to pretend it didn't happen or run around and try to get around it. I just come clean. I just think that creates more honesty and more trust if the case is true between an administrator and a teacher, if I've done something with a teacher that wasn't right, I'm going to come clean and say, you know what, I'm sorry, that was my bad. I shouldn't have done it that way. I think that builds trust. You know what I'm saying? One thing I want to say too, let me go back to the, one of the things we talk a little bit about, and we're talking about, is the perception people have. I have a quote that I love, and I want you to hear it. Perception means we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. That goes back to kind of what we were talking about in the beginning, about realizing that everyone is coming to the table with a perception of how life is, how a worldview, how they see the world. And your worldview may be, I always laugh about my husband's worldview is very methodical, he's very detailed. Everything is detailed. He wants to know the deets on everything. And I have no capacity for detail. And so if I know we're going to have a hard conversation, I better come to the table with some understanding of the way he sees the world. That's true of my teachers too. My teachers, generally, we've done the Enneagram, we've done the DISC profile, we've done like over 17 years, probably 3 or 4 personality tests. And almost always I am the only one that's the big picture vision person. And everyone else is super detailed. They're rule followers. They don't like conflict. They don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. They want to please. So when I come in with a different worldview and try to talk to a teacher with my worldview and I don't acknowledge how they see things, that doesn't work. So that was one thing I did want to make sure y'all heard that. All right. So building relationships. So we're gonna really work to build relationships. And when you do that, you earn the right to be heard. And we say this to our teachers all the time. If you will make a connection with your students in the beginning of the year and their parents, then anything you have to say to them will be accepted because they trust you. I have a first grade teacher who, the kids love her and the parents love her. And she is no nonsense. She is not going to put up with anything. And they love her. And so even my parents that have been in kindergarten the year before, who have given the kindergarten teacher fits, they come to first grade and they're like, yes, ma'am. They say, yes, ma'am to Lacey, because she takes the time to build relationships with her parents. I think that that's what we've done here at St. Albans. Is I think I've taken the time to build relationships with my teachers. And so if I have to sit down and have a tough conversation, they're willing to listen. Love, anger, and frustration are almost always rooted in fear. Fear dominates every difficult conversation, in my opinion. Hearing bad news from someone is always easier when you know they care about you. And so we say that all the time in parent conferences. Teachers, make sure that parent knows that you love their kid.
Well, and I hope that one of the takeaways from all of us participating in this conversation today is the importance of preparing for that difficult conversation. And the best way to prepare for that is to use this strategy. Build relationships, really make sure that we're bending over backwards to demonstrate the care and concern that we have for the families. That's one of the best strategies you can employ, because it's not if, it's when the time comes for that difficult conversation. All of that investment that you put into the relationship pays off in dividends when it's time to have the difficult conversation.
Right. I love the John Maxwell, earn the right to be heard. Right. We have to earn that. That to me, seeking to understand a situation and listening, it's critical. It really is. So strategy number 6, having conversations with your mouth. So this is kind of a funny one, but it's important, especially in the age of social media. We run into big issues with teachers trying to have conversations with parents via text and email. And for the record, I have put down a pretty firm mandate that staff is not allowed to text parents. We're not going to text parents. We have the Remind app, and you can text parents through that, but private text messaging, because we just were having real issues with parents texting, right after school, they would text a teacher and say, well, so-and-so hit so-and-so, and what do you know about that? And they're often misunderstood and misread, and the intent is rarely communicated through a text or an email.
When was that policy implemented?
This year we've really done it. I've said it for 2 years.
Right.
We don't provide our teachers their own cell phones. And so consequently, some of our teachers, we're in a small town, and some of our teachers were friends with kids' parents. And it just became a real issue where a teacher felt like that they had to respond at 8:00 at night, or, teachers would get emails, angry emails because, a parent was frustrated about homework, and then they would zip off a nasty email to the teacher, and then the teacher didn't sleep all night. It was just tough. It's also that they can be screenshotted and put on Facebook. And quite frankly, that's not healthy for anybody. So we do use the Remind app, but we really encourage our teachers to have conversations with their mouth. Pick up the phone and call a parent. Pick up the phone, have a conversation, call a meeting. The more you are conversing, they hear the inflection of your voice. They hear the caring and concern. When you email, they don't hear that.
Right.
And it can come across terse or mean or whatever. And so we've really tried to encourage our teachers. It's hard. I did have a teacher that it backfired on her recently because she wanted the parent to know what happened. And so she told her, when she came in to pick up her son, and the parent was mad because she told her face to face because she felt that was more aggressive. And I said, well, you can feel that way, but the reality is we want to be able to have conversations with you that we want you to hear our caring and concern. So that, it doesn't backfire very often, but occasionally it does. So strategy number 7, don't climb the ladder of inference. This is my favorite. I learned this from my former rector, Scott Brown, who's now at TMI. The ladder of inference is climbing the ladder of inference is kind of four steps. Take in all the information. So you experience the signs, the sounds, and the feelings, and some you process, and some get filtered through your own experience. Then you begin to interpret that information. You base it on your experiences and your interpretation. You give meaning. You draw conclusions, and then you look for signs to reinforce your story. So one of the examples that he gave that I thought was great was I'm standing in front of a faculty meeting, and I see somebody and I'm giving a presentation, and I see my assistant in the back on her cell phone. So I see that. I take in that information. I see that she's on her cell phone while I'm talking. I interpret that she's texting while I'm giving this important information. I draw conclusions that she must be bored with my conversation, and that's why she's texting. And then I look around for signs to reinforce my story. I see her yawn. And so now I've decided, well, she doesn't like me, and she thinks I'm boring, and I must be a terrible speaker. So that's me.
And that is so easy. That's such an easy trap for all of us to fall into.
I tell myself a story about it, right? And so the real truth in that scenario is that Tracy was taking notes on my speech. She was writing down points that she wanted to visit with me further about. And so I come to her and I say, okay.
And she yawned because it was 4:15 in the afternoon.
Yeah. And she yawned because, it's 4:15 in the afternoon. And so I go to her and I say, the story I'm telling myself is, so I can do one of two things. I can either be mad and go, Tracy hates me. Or I can say, Tracy, the story I'm telling myself is that you were texting during my presentation. And she can be direct enough to say, No, I was taking notes because I wanted to talk to you about some of the points you made. Oh, well, that makes sense. But climbing the ladder of inference is always dangerous. And so I recommend that you not do it because you're always going to end up thinking the wrong thing.
Okay, so what strategies can you offer for when you feel, maybe you're about to take that first wrong or the second wrong?
Right.
What strategies can you deploy?
Well, the real strategy is to go to the source and to say, and this is the way we always say it. The story I'm telling myself is, and the reason you say it that way is because then you're not attacking. I'm not going to her and saying, hey,
why were you taking,
yeah,
why were you texting during my meeting? Yeah.
Why are you bored? No. Why this is the story I'm telling myself. And I have used that, the story I'm telling myself is, I've used that 1,000 times. I use it in my marriage. I use it in my friends, because we all climb the ladder of inference and we all interpret information through our own lens, through our own experience. Maybe somebody did say one time to me that you're a terrible speaker. Why do you even bother? And I've held that on to myself. And so as soon as somebody does something that I draw conclusions, I interpret that the way I see it through my own baggage.
That's critical.
Yeah. And so finally, this is really maybe seems weird as a strategy, but it's an important one. Stay healthy. I don't know how many actual administrators we have. I think probably mostly administrators in this webinar, but you guys, self-care, absolutely the most critical thing you can do to be able to see things as they truly are. When we are unhealthy in mind, body, or spirit, we will always climb the ladder of inference. And I speak from experience. I am a person who needs incredibly lots of sleep. I have to sleep a lot. And what we do is pretty stressful, which means that you probably need to sleep even more. I have to have a healthy mind. And so, to find someone who can talk through issues with, it is always helpful to be able to find somebody that you can talk to and say, hey, here's what's going on. How do you think I should handle that? Or how do you see it? For me, that has always been my priest. I have been blessed to have 3 fantastic priests who are healthy and spiritually the leaders of our community, and that's always been that. If you are the head of the school, it is a lonely place. You have no peer. The priest is your only peer. And so if you don't have that, having a board chair that you can be honest with, and I've had some great board chairs that have helped me with that, I think that that's really critical. The second thing, the healthy body, I cannot stress this enough. The times that I have been had the most difficult time in my job have been when I have been out of my health routine, not exercising, eating junk, feeling, I know we all have the lounge and the food, it's like food is created in the lounge. I don't even know who's making it, but it just shows up and it's almost always candy, or
especially this time of year.
Sugar. Yes. And I can tell you that on the day, Halloween, Christmas, Valentine's Day, Easter, those days where it's just, I cannot do it. Getting plenty of rest, getting exercise, feeling good physically will allow you to have conversations that are hard and deal with stress much easier. And then, of course, the healthy spirit, lots and lots of prayer. Prayer before you go into it. That goes back to being prepared. Prayer before you go into a tough situation. Pray. I have walked my campus when I knew I had to have a hard conversation. I have gotten out of my office, walked around the whole campus a couple of times praying, asking God to help me have the right words, asking God to help me hear, asking God to help me see things from his perspective. It almost always works out well that way, as opposed to not doing that. So stay healthy so that you can manage your job, because it's a very stressful job. Questions for us?
As people are coming up with their questions, and again, gang, in your questions in the Q&A box, I want to go to one question that we already received as we may be receiving some more right now. One question came up about the difficulty in conversations related to fundraising. So
The ask.
exactly. So we're not going to, and I made a comment about, we're going to do our annual fund webinar down the road. We've got a capital campaign webinar coming down the road. So we don't need to get into the nuts and bolts about, about that whole process. But I would like to know, were fundraising conversations difficult for you? And if so, what are some strategies you can use? Because that can be a stressful conversation that we haven't really touched on.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, maybe it was. I'm sort of a natural salesman, so when I get excited about something, I feel it is easy for me to talk about it and to sell it. Having said that, so the asks have not been difficult for me. What has been difficult at times, I had a difficult conversation with a donor one year who is one of my biggest donors, and all of a sudden he just wasn't given. And I had hired a development director, which I only did once in all these years, and I had to have a difficult conversation. I had to call him and say, what is happening? I'm wondering if you're going to be able to give to this. And he was like, I'm not giving this year. And that was difficult because I had to listen and find out why. Well, it turned out he didn't want to give to anybody but me. And I didn't call and I didn't ask. And so he didn't give. And right or wrong, that was a difficult conversation to have. The challenge of learning to be a fundraiser when you're ahead of school is hard, and it is a different webinar, but it does get easier. That's the only thing I can say is when making the asks, it gets easier.
But I think in a lot of I put the strategy, hopefully you can see, is the strategy screen up, MK?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think a lot of those strategies definitely apply.
Oh, definitely.
So I think the build relationships piece is critical.
Absolutely.
Because when we get into fundraising and that topic, it's always about the relationship, in my opinion.
Yes.
I think the be prepared
people
piece.
Give to people. People don't give to
exactly
organizations, they give to people.
Yeah, and I think the be prepared piece is important as well.
Yeah, be authentic.
Yeah. So that's a different type of difficult conversation, but I think a lot of the strategies that we've talked about today can certainly apply to those difficult conversations, those anxiety-provoking conversations.
Right.
We're going to stay on the line for a little bit longer. And again, if there are any questions, make sure to type them into the Q&A box and we will take them in order.